Elizabeth, you can start.
Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. So excited to be introducing you all to Dr. Rita Charon. Dr. Rita Charon is a general internist and literary scholar who originated the field of narrative medicine. She is the Bernard Schoenberg Professor of Social Medicine, the founding chair of the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics, and Professor of Medicine at Columbia University, Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. She serves as the Executive Director of Columbia Narrative Medicine. She completed the MD at Harvard and the Ph.D. in English at Columbia, concentrating on the works of Henry James. Her research investigates narrative medicine training, reflective practice, healthcare justice, and healthcare team effectiveness, and has been supported by the NIH, the NEH, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, and many other private foundations. She was selected by the NEH to deliver the Jefferson Lecture in 2018, which is the highest academic distinction awarded by the Endowment. She has authored, co-authored, or co-edited 4 books on narrative medicine. She lectures and teaches internationally on narrative medicine and is widely published in leading medical and literary journals. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Rita Charon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to see people from so many different disciplines here in the audience. I must preface by wondering out loud whether any of you remember the founder of University of Connecticut School of Public Health. It was like 15, 20 years ago. Do you remember Eileen Story? Yes. Eileen Story is a dear friend of mine. We were classmates at Harvard in medical school. And I was with her as she was conspiring to bring a School of Public Health to your campus. Eileen died 2 years ago of aggressive metastatic breast cancer. And I raise her in memory to thank her for the tremendous influence that she has had on public health in general, as well as in your institution. And I want to keep her memory somehow alive, my dear friend Eileen. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction. And indeed, I'm a general internist. I'm a medical doctor. And my practice has been in the community clinics of Presbyterian Hospital at Columbia for many, many years. But my medical work ended up entailing aspects of close listening closely to what patients tell me. And I found out that eventually I needed some training in actually what is a story and how does one understand it. But just as a preface, before I start showing you some slides, narrative medicine arose in the end of the 1990s. And it was at the time a response of a group of us at Columbia, a response to a medicine that already at that time was fragmented, impersonal, corporatized, and we thought that bringing in skills from the humanities and the arts was one way to really restore the focus on what it is that patients tell us and what it is that we as clinicians owe them. Of course, in retrospect, what we are now seeing is the future of what we discerned back in the 1990s. And if anything, it's gotten much worse. I think all of you will agree with me that if we were watching the electronic medical records speed things up, the productivity quotas, the malpractice situation, the corporatization of healthcare, it's at this point, of course, gotten drastically worse. It's not like bringing narrative medicine in with our humanities and the arts, we're able to fix anything. And yet we see how critical it is for us now to join forces. And that's why I love giving talks to groups like yours, to join forces with those who are doing work in creativity, work in what has come to be called well-being, but really means saving people from suicide and retirement, yes. Um, Allying with forces who continue to pay attention to the individuals, be it the individual patients or the individual clinicians. And in fact, we are doing very, very much more work with patients, patient advocacy, community groups than we were early on. But it was early in my own practice of general internal medicine, primary care medicine, that I figured out that what patients paid me to do was to listen to what they told me. Tout court, that's it. But I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know enough about what happens when one person tells another person that something happened. So on a gamble, I went to the English department and I said, kind of hat in hand, can you teach a doctor something about how stories work? And they were so welcoming. They thought it was a great idea to add to what they knew about storytelling and narrative theory, the kinds of ways that it actually works in the real world. So indeed, through a master's and then a PhD in English, I did learn, how do stories work? How are they built? How do they connect the teller to the listener or the writer to the reader? How do different readers or listeners hear conflicting stories? And how ultimately does reading and hearing and telling and writing stories change who we are? So I'm going to have to show you some pictures so that you know what I'm talking about. Ha! Do you all see that? Somebody give me a thank you. Okay. Some of you will recognize Klimt. This is Klimt, the Austrian symbolist. This is a 1905 painting. It's called The Three Ages of Woman. And I mention the date to let you know that I am not going against copyright um, regulations, and everything I'm showing you was made before 1924. So it's all in the public domain. So what do we have here? It's called Three Ages of Woman. And you see, amid the elaborate design of Klimt, Gustav Klimt, we see three figures: a sleeping infant in the arms of a sleeping looking young woman, and in off to the left hand side, an old woman. Yes, we see a woman with sagging breasts, with a kind of bloated abdomen, uh, with a hump on her back, and her head in her hands. So all of us are looking at this. Each of us is wondering about the baby, looking so comfortable and beautiful and angelic, looking at what we presume is the mother, with flowers in her hair and a look of bliss on her face. And then the old, I'm going to say, crone in the background, hiding her head or holding her head in either regret or despair or awareness. It could be an awareness that what she's looking down upon, the mother and the child, is something that came from her own fruition. Do you see that? That either the old woman is the scourge and who wants that future, or the old woman is the source of all of this generativity. So this is my way of introducing to you the idea of perspective, of perspectival thought and vision. And that as we examine a story someone's telling us, or a story in action in our office, how often, those of you who are clinicians, do you have the mother, the grandmother, and the child in one room? It happens all the time. Or you have the patient, the home attendant, and the interpreter. See, so we're always working with different perspectives, all three at once. And we, the watcher, the listener, has to say, who is represented? What are they trying to tell me? How are these figures related to one another? And what simply are they saying? So the early parts of narrative medicine were devoted to developing methods to listen from the perspectives of patients and clients. And we found ways and we tested the ways, and they worked in many different settings. I'll give you some examples later. Um, we taught in three different movements. The first movement is attention. How do we sharpen, focus the capacity of a listener or a viewer to really donate all that concentration to the case at hand? And there are ways to train for that. We learned, and this is mostly from aesthetic theory, that in order to perceive something, the perceiver has to represent it in some way. You got to write it down. You got to sketch it. You got to dance it. You got to compose it. You got to, in some way, capture in form what it is that you're seeing. Otherwise, it goes away. And so we teach writing a lot, and we teach drawing a lot, and we teach drama, and we teach music a lot. And the third movement, attention, representation, is affiliation, which is to say, in the course of these things, there become sturdy links, sturdy partnerships between those who are working together. And that really is the ultimate goal, whether we're talking about a healthcare team on the wards, or we're talking about a facilitator in a small group, or a teacher and her learners. And so you can tell, just from what I've said, what kind of training we give our graduate students, our medical students in narrative medicine. It includes literary theory, it includes aesthetic theory, it includes phenomenology, which is the study, of course, of intersubjective relation. And it almost goes without saying that it includes also um, 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 lessons in and dimensions of health equity, health activism, health advocacy. So it's the listening for the voice that is the beginning of the work that we try to encourage. I'm going to show you a quote from Carol Gilligan. Some of you will remember her pioneering work in 1984 as a psychologist for the very first time, listening to girls. Listening to girls. Here's what she said. Speaking and listening is like breathing in and breathing out. And I can see that and psychological troubles come when people start holding their breath, when they cannot take in what others are saying or let out what they are feeling and thinking. Voice is an instrument of relation or relationship. And so this we take very seriously. We know that in French, the word is langue, right? Langue. Well, it means two things, language, but it also means tongue, the literal organ, tongue. So that when we listen, we're listening not only to the words that are produced, but we're listening to the body that makes that voice, that tells that story. And we remember, I mean, some of us are indeed clinicians and do physical exams all the time. We remember that the body is a physical object, and the stories that our bodies produce are marked by our culture, our race, our gender, our class, our position. All of this comes with the voice. The stories are delicate and the stories are indestructible. I could go on and on characterizing the high stakes, the explosive nature of the stories that we're able to hear, if indeed we know how to absorb what is being expressed, communicated, what the mood is, We even have to pay attention, of course, to the silences. Now, in addition to understanding the words of another, patient, client, colleague, we also have to comprehend our own experience. We have to come to see, reflect, self-examine what it is that we are bringing to a situation of listening. What is our position, our positionality? What are our biases, our prejudices, our assumptions, be it implicit or explicit? All of this is necessary in order to take in um, authentically and responsibly what it is another tells us. And again, I don't have to say every time, but I'm underlining the situations when telling goes on in healthcare settings, because the stakes are different from the telling that goes on in a podcast or in a graphic novel or in a novel by Jane Austen. The stakes are different. I'm going to show you next some of the things that allow us to listen with what we call narrative humility. All right? Narrative humility is the realization that you know very little about that other person. See? So this is an odd list. The one listening, the interviewer, the clinician, has to be as neutral as possible, to not be expecting this instead of that. I call this to my students radical dumbness, that you go into a conversation without really expecting to know the answer. Even though you've got the EMR open and you know what the MRI looked like and you know what all the labs are, it's a radical dumbness that you're reaching toward. You're not looking for predetermined answers to predetermined questions. And many of my colleagues, and I too am guilty of this, go into a setting saying, well, I got to know more about the chest pain. I got to know when's the last time she got her flu shot, etc. And this is where I will come back to the ways in which our monetized, corporatized health system is forcing us to do things like this. But ideally, for the one listening with radical humility, there are no questions, there are invitations. Not where does it hurt, but tell me more about that. I'm curious about that. Tell me an example of that. No questions, only invitations. And then more necessary, no judgment, only discovery. This is very, very hard for those who listen, especially across gulfs, the kind of gulfs that we might have within a healthcare related interview, where things like blame come in and things like, self-inflicted come in. The reminder to my students to follow your partner's moves. If the patient says something really unusual, you got to say, what does that mean? Even if it brings you off the track of your listening. So the kinds of attitudes I list at the bottom: unguarded, fearless, affiliated, curious, respectful, are not always the ways in which we are able, in the current health delivery systems, to listen to our clients and our patients. And yet, indeed, that's what we are aiming for. And it may be some time from now. Now, let me bring this back or forward to a situation. This is Whistler, sea and rain. This was 1865 on the coast of Brittany. And what we see is, I think you all will agree with me if I narrate this image, knowing that there are many, many different ways to appreciate it. But we see what looks like the sky. We see a line of horizon in the bottom third. We see a brownish, bluish sea with waves and wavelets. We see what looks like maybe like a sandbar, um, with 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 water trapped in between. See, see the water is trapped between the sea here and a bar, something like that. And then we see a figure. We see what looks like a human figure. The human figure is kind of translucent. I hope you can see that. You kind of can see through the figure's legs. And also the head seems kind of translucent. When I first saw this, and I remember spending like an hour with this painting in a gallery in DC, I said, well, was Whistler trying to erase the figure after he put it there? Or was it an afterthought? Oh, I might as well put in a figure for scale. What? Why does it look so like uh, 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 um, incidental? And as I sat with this painting, I saw that I could see it in a whole other way. That either that figure was an afterthought, or was being erased, or was incidental, or I could look at this and say, oh my, all that sea and sky and sand is there for this one guy. And I understood that these two opposites were in resonance with one another, kind of like a molecule with an L dimer and a D dimer, those of you who remember your chemistry. And it wasn't that it was one or the other, but that they had to, in some way, uneasily coexist. And I hope as I'm saying this, and I'm sorry I can't see you all at the same time that I'm showing you my slides, but I'll see you all soon, at least in your WebEx boxes. Um, Translated to the medical setting, of course, a patient is either dwarfed by the whole system, dwarfed, incidental, or the whole system is there for them. And that becomes our challenge. How do we, within our own practices and within the policies and oversight that creates the context for these conversations, how do we make it happen that the system is there for them? I'm going to tell you a story from my own practice. A few years ago, 46-year-old woman comes in to see me for the first time. I'm her assigned PCP, primary care provider. It turns out she has had already several primary care providers and keeps getting kind of bumped from one to the next. Sometimes it's a resident who's leaving the institution, things like that. So I meet her. I introduce myself as her new doctor, her new internist, and ask her to tell me about her situation. And I say very specifically, I will be your doctor. I need to know about your body and your health and your life. Please tell me what you think I should know about your situation. That's what I say as I meet a new patient. And she starts at the beginning. This is a 46-year-old woman who um, was seemed rather reluctant to speak. But she starts at the beginning. She says, I'm a diabetic. I was juvenile diabetic. I've been on insulin since I'm in grade school. I have been under the care of so many pediatricians and then pediatric endocrinologists, and then pediatric diabetes specialists. I've been on any number of insulin regimens and insulin pumps, off insulin pumps. And then she says I became a grown-up. So I had to leave all the pediatric doctors and I had to start all over again with a general internist and then an endocrinologist and then a diabetologist and then finally the clinical trials for diabetes. And she's getting more and more kind of worked up as she's telling me this. And I'm hearing, as I'm listening, this story of abandonment and the rage that goes along with that. At one point, it looked like she was going to start to cry, but she didn't. Instead, she looked all the angrier and focused what felt to me like great rage as she looks at me. She looks right into my eyes. She says, "You want to know what I want? You want to know what I need? I need a new set of teeth." And indeed, she had been kind of holding her hand like this as she spoke. Well, she had no teeth on her upper jaw. Um, she had had bad gum disease. They took all her teeth away. Um, and they had given her a denture. The denture didn't fit for very long. It harmed her gums. She was unable to use it. And Medicaid wouldn't give her another set of teeth. So she finds herself withdrawing and withdrawing. And she didn't go out with her friends. She wasn't going to the parties she used to go to. She didn't go to dances. She became a recluse. So now I would never have started a plan for a new patient with a visit to the dental clinic, but that's what I did. I said, if that's your primary problem, let's go after that first. And happily, I have friends in the dental clinic, and we got her a quick appointment. The social worker was able to get a Medicaid, waiver for a second denture. And in a few months, I'd seen her in the interim, but in a few months, she comes back. Glorious smile, beautiful smile. She was a very beautiful woman. And she was triumphant that she got her teeth. She started to see her friends again. She started a business, oddly, a baking business, a catering business. Um, she went to dances. She went on trips. She fell in love. And I just will never forget that because it was an extreme example of listening. What is it that you want? She told me what she wanted. I found a way to give it to her. I was, of course, Rita, what are you doing? You're not going to send her straight to the clinical trial. I just was able to wait and see. And indeed, once she had the teeth, and once she saw my commitment to her agenda, she would do anything I told her to do. And this is not boasting, but she felt that she and I were able to make decisions taking her authority in hand. So, how does this work in the real world? I want to switch now to some of the findings. We've been through the time of our development of this work doing a variety of outcome studies. We have many different goals depending on where the study takes place, but we're always seeking ways to validate or confirm that these approaches to clinical work matter. And sometimes it's more that these teaching approaches matter. We do a whole lot of teaching for pre-med students, medical students, residents, interns, faculty, and we're always looking for ways to assess whether these pedagogic methods have any value or consequence at all. So I'm going to show you a few of the results. The first one is a study of burnout. This was at NYU. I don't run all these studies. I mean, I try not to because it would seem a little counterproductive, but I ask other people to use these methods and see what the outcomes are. So the first one was done at NYU in the obstetrics and gynecology department. It was a study using narrative medicine workshops with OBGYN residents. It was not mandated. They could come if they wanted. It was once a month. And every month, they either read something very carefully, a literary text or a newspaper article text, or they looked at images together, like we have been doing with our Whistler and our Klimt. Um, and then at the end of the period, they examined they decided to compare the low attenders with the high attenders to these workshops. Some just went to one or two, others went to four, six, eight, and then to compare those groups on the Maslach burnout scale. This is what you see here. Uh, Many of you are probably familiar with the triad of emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and personal sense of agency or accomplishment. And what they showed was that those who got a high dose of narrative medicine were statistically significantly less emotionally exhausted than those who did not get a high dose. Um, the depersonalization and personal accomplishment were not changed. The second one I want to show you is with medical students. These were in also OBGYN, as it turns out, at Columbia. We were trying to train medical students to address the many options that a newly pregnant woman had in terms of her pregnancy. And of course, there are several options, including seeing a pregnancy to term, arresting the pregnancy with an abortion, going through with a pregnancy toward adoption. These are all the potential outcomes that a pregnant woman needed to consider. Um, and in this study, they used narrative medicine to train the medical students simply to ask rather neutral questions to find out how much the woman understood about her options. It was not a endorsement of any one of those options, but they wanted to make sure that we were teaching our Columbia medical students to help the newly pregnant woman understand what the many options she had for her pregnancy were. So they did this teaching randomly to half the class of students, and and then did an OSCE. I don't know if you all know what an OSCE is. It's an objective study where we get standardized patients, like actors pretending to be patients, but they can actually interact in the very same way with each of 140 students. So that was the method they used, and they discovered that the students who had had the narrative medicine training were were statistically significantly more likely to emerge with the patient having heard all her options. This a priori scale is a selection of the particular pieces of information that we were looking for to make sure that that the patient heard all of the options. It sounds like a small thing, but it's a major endorsement of how you can train in 1 hour. You can train a health provider to listen neutrally, to use the narrative humility we were talking about, so as to help the patient take in all of the possible alternatives and not only the ones that you think, you, the interviewer, are the best ones. This third one is from a trial that's still in progress at a cancer center. We developed in an extensive qualitative research project the 4 different data sets. There was, and this was a 6-session narrative medicine training that we brought to the cancer center staff and faculty. So after, and it was 6 sessions over a period of several months, and it was rigorous narrative medicine, reading, writing, looking at images, sharing their writing. In the course of which they ended up knowing a fair amount about one another. So this is showing in the blue bars the focus group assortment of themes, and these at the bottom are the codes that we used in the coding. The green and the red, are the results of the stakeholders. We also interviewed some of the hospital leadership. And the silver bars are the ones where we went back to individuals 4 months after they did the training. And the only thing I want you to see on this graph is that by and large, the blues and the greens travel together. By and large, the orange is the repeat interview by the stakeholders, which I'm not going to talk about. But the silver ones are the ones where we went back to the participants and asked them what they remember and what they retained. And this was a striking increase in what we coded as self-development. They weren't so interested anymore in, I got along with my peers, I understood something about my teammates. By 4 months out, what has happened is that these trained staff members were deep in a kind of introspective, reflective, I'm going to call it existential mode of understanding something about their own selves. And the sub-themes there were things like I'm becoming a better version of myself. Some of them said it's made me, because of that, a better health practitioner. Others said, I appreciate myself. I have given myself self-care. So that's an example of how wide the outcomes are. This final one is now we have to end at 1:15. So I'm not going to read this, but just to say at the very end, this was a workshop on race and justice. And we really focused on teaching toward racial consciousness. And what this person, and I know that it was a white participant, said, I found myself being exposed, but I could feel it was important, educational, and constructive. I was pushed to confront my hypocrisy. I think that's a rather impressive outcome for a 2.5-day workshop with a group of white and persons of color together, learning in great detail about some of the critical race theory and some of the texts that have been brought to us by Black writers. I will end with 3 images that bring us back to what we're doing in healthcare, and both with patients and within ourselves. Now, don't be frightened. This is a fresco from 1456. It is in Palermo. It was It was produced, 1456 is the time of the Black Plague. And you see here you see the central figure, which is death, on the skeletal steed. The name of this is Triumph of Death. And I show it only to remind you that in all our ecstasy at our great research gains, we do not triumph over death. We do our work in the shadow of death. Why do I show you this gruesome image? Because it just brings us modestly to understand that death indeed has the final word. But before that comes, here's Cezanne, 1890, card players. Now, I call this a conversation. These men are not talking to one another. They're deeply engaged in their card game. Cezanne used as models the workers on his father's farm in the south of France. And this was Cezanne's way of elevating the workers. He calls them the peasants. That's what they were called at the time. And he is showing them in nobility. Very quietly, the wine bottle in the back. They're obviously in some kind of cafe. So familiar in their own selves, not talking, but conversing. I hope you see that. And this last slide, now this is not done out of what would be the noun to that? I'm not being egomaniacal, but I'm showing a picture that has me in it. And that's because it was taken by a stranger in the Museum of Modern Art. The stranger was behind my friend and me as we were visiting Rothko's Black, Red, Brown, 1959. And I want to end with this because this too is a conversation. I hope you see that. That I'm the one on the left. I'm leaning forward into the Rothko. My former colleague, my former student, now colleague, is also leaning into the Rothko. We're not talking to one another. We are visiting this painting together, and we, like the card players, are joined in the image. And this is what happens anytime we teach this way, we teach narrative this way, that those observing a text, an image, a patient are themselves joining, they are uniting within that object itself. And that's the end of my slides. Now, I hope you've stuck with me through this. We probably went in some directions that you haven't gone in other kinds of presentations, but I'm all ears to hear what you might want to bring up in discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charon, for that wonderful talk. We will now use the remainder of our time together to ask questions. So if you have a question, you can either put it in the chat or you may unmute yourself and ask the question. Questions for Dr. Charon? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Corin Clark. Dr. Charon, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a nurse practitioner, and I began my practice as a nurse in a hospital, some 30 years ago. And at that time, I really valued the time I had with patients. And I felt some sympathy for my new medical colleagues who on average had 6 minutes per patient per day. And I thought, gosh, what
Yeah.
sort of interaction are they having with patients? And, how are they gaining from the stories of, these patients? So I wonder if in your work, if you paired at all with nursing colleagues, because I think that's been more of our sort of professional development is to tap into the stories of patients.
Yes, thank you very much for that question. One of the things that my division of narrative medicine does is to run the interprofessional education program for the entire health sciences campus so that we get um, students in the dental school, medical school, nursing school, school of public health, occupational therapy, physical therapy, nutrition, uh, genetic counseling, chaplaincy, and social work. And we're able to do teaching programs with these assorted um, 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 trainees and faculty. We would love if this kind of work was mandated by all the schools and they would require it. They don't exactly, although they're starting to. But the point is that the students want more and more and more. Anytime we bring students together from different disciplines, they understand why they're here. We put all of them through a required orientation to the medical center where they at least hear some of the concerns of others. And when we have these shared classrooms with all the students in it, and we say, okay, here's a case. What do you think we need to know from this child and the parents with a cleft palate, for example? And the students understand that they need the perspectives of their colleagues. And they get to the end and they say, how am I going to practice? I don't have a public health person on my team now. What am I going to do? So I think we physicians are most hampered by our professionalization. I know that the others feel also hampered, maybe not to the extent that we do. And I know that we, the physicians, need good examples and models of ways that we can better um, hear our patients' concerns. I don't know if we're going to get there, Corin Clark. I really don't know. Um, but the interprofessional way is certainly an avenue forward.
Thank you. The next question comes from Dr. Kim Gans, who asks, hi, I enjoyed your presentation. Do you have any examples of how narratives may have changed policy, either at the institutional or governmental level?
Well, we see a lot of that. Now, remember that narratives don't just happen in healthcare. And at the beginning of our work, we were very kind of tuned in. It's narrative medicine and it's in healthcare, and here's how we're going to do it. And then we started listening more carefully to the public sector. And there's narratives in congressional hearings, and there's narratives in the New York Times, and there's narratives. I mean, it's become, some of my colleagues in narratology, which is the science of narrative, are saying, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? This storytelling boom, they call it. And so it's a great question because policy people don't come to medical centers. Policy people do their work in cabinet meetings, in health and human services, in the legislative bodies, in the state legislators, which are all the more important these days of left to right rift. So absolutely, and we've been working with people who are getting ready to give such testimony. And certainly in the patient advocacy realm, patients themselves are very adept at putting forth their own, it could be a history, their own story of their own illness, or ways in which their illness and those who have it can be better served. The person who asked the question, browse illness narratives and you will be stunned at how many of these books, magazine articles, blog posts are out there. We just have to harness them, and policy has to harness them. It's a great way to get the temperature of the public. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question comes from Catriona Hong, who asks, have you come across a way in which we can best implement the practice of narrative medicine as medical providers in a way that is both integrative and sustainable to daily practice?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'm an advocate of going department by department. The psychiatrists don't need the same intervention that the surgeons need. The ophthalmologists don't respond to the same intervention that the palliative care people do. And so it's a tailored approach. My group and I have fanned out. So when the ophthalmologist came to me to say, Rita, can you come do what you do? They don't even know what to call it. But I chose one of my colleagues who's a visual artist and very skilled in visual knowledge. And she has brought to her ophthalmologists, and these are residents and faculty, not students. She brings them once a month something to look at, something to read, something to think about. They are now back to me saying, Rita, we're writing a outcome study on what has happened since we've been working with Lynn. And can you please give us some examples of journals that might publish this? So it went the next step where the learners themselves were so able to see the outcome on them that they wanted to report it. Now look, I have kind of reluctantly at Columbia joined the march toward well-being. I don't know, is this, I assume this is a thing at UConn, I don't know. But at the beginning, wellness, well-being were kind of, let's give them a little break, let's give them half a day off, maybe we give them a little yoga, maybe we give them an ice cream break, and it was like silly. And I didn't want any part of it because ours is really serious, risky, hard work to do. Well, I've changed my mind because the well-being movement has finally come around to not just ice cream socials, but pressure on the administration to increase the hiring of nurses, pressure on the hospital to allow the union to continue. Do you see? So that the structural things that are causing people to quit early, to in the worst possible situation take their lives, this happens, to just get so deflated and emotionally exhausted that they're just doing rote work, disillusioned, not interested in their patients. So that takes serious work. And what I can say to the respondent is to the questioner, is it's got to be tailored to the actual situation. The staff in the medical intensive care unit is not going to need the same things that the ophthalmologists need. So that makes our work harder because we have to design everything for a purpose. But it's a way for the departments themselves or the specialties to be accountable to their own trainees and their own faculty.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question in the chat. Sarah Willen says, thank you so much, Dr. Charon, for a marvelous presentation. I'm a medical anthropologist, and many of those here today are students in an introductory medical anthropology course. In our course, we're putting your powerful work in conversation with Arthur Kleinman's work on illness narratives. As you know, Kleinman proposes a series of specific questions. He invites clinicians to pose in approaching their patients with the goal of eliciting their explanatory models.
Yes.
Could you maybe say a bit about the difference between a narrative of medicine approach, and Kleinman's illness narrative / explanatory models approach?
So Kleinman and I kind of grew up together. He's a little bit older than I am, but we've been kind of partnering over the decades, really. And he's visited us at Columbia many times. I'm interested at the prominence or the predominance of medical anthropologists in your group. My department is medical humanities and ethics. I have a division of ethics, a division of social medicine, and a division of narrative medicine. And as I do searches, the faculty, especially at the senior levels, are all anthropologists in ethics, in social medicine, in narrative medicine. So you all have some of the keys to the kingdom here. It's a very close neighborhood between, roughly speaking, my work and Kleinman's. I think that Kleinman in his last book really became autobiographical and told a story about his wife's decline and his becoming the caregiver. So that was very much more introspective. It was his spiritual journey through the illness and death of his wife. But before that, his illness narratives books was really a primer in the narrative theories and narrative concepts that help in healthcare. So the Kleinman questions, we teach them to all our PNS medical students, and I hope we use them too. What do you think is going on? What do you call this illness, right? Great question.
Wonderful. Dr. Charon, we are at 1:30, and so I want to respect our time. Everyone, please thank Dr. Charon for such a wonderful presentation. It's been a privilege to have you with us.
Thank you.
Round of applause.
Great. Thank you very much. You never know. So I appreciate your comments. Thanks. And we're close. We're neighbors, so we'll see one another again.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Good. Okay.